I'll go ahead and get started, and I'm sure the Fairbanks people can jump in and understand what's going on. Okay, there we go. And maybe to give you a little bit more background and details about some of the products and results that we have from the REA. You've already seen this map of where we know there are infestations of non-native plants. And maybe a take-home message here is they're widely distributed kind of throughout the region. They tend to be associated, though, with areas of human habitation or along some of the larger rivers like the Kuskokwim River on sandbars and things like that. By and large, these are not particularly dangerous species, thinking about their potential impact to the ecology of the region. And so this table on the right-hand side here is all 41 species or 42 species that have been recorded in the YKL region, coded by their perceived ecological impacts, with the warmer colors indicating more potentially damaging species. And you can see that those species that we consider either highly or moderately highly invasive species, the pink and red ones, those are just a handful of species. And I don't know if you can make out the number of infestations, but these species that are in red and pink, they're only known from 2 to 3 infestations, almost always within places like McGrath or Galena.
Matt, can you read like the top 4?
Okay, yeah. So Melolotus alba, or sweet clover, that's one of the most highly invasive species that we have in the state of Alaska. That's known from just 2 invasions. Carragena arborescens is Siberian pea shrub. That's known from just 2 locations. Prunus patus and Prunus virginianus are bird cherries, and those are just known from McGrath in just a couple locations. And then Vicia cracca is bird vetch. So those are, and that's just known in 1 location. So those are the kind of bad players, but they're really, really geographically restricted, so that's the good news. And then you can look down through this table and see that there are some things like Crepus pictorum or yellow hawksbeard that's got like over 100 infestations, but it's not that invasive. It's pretty pervasive across the region, but it's probably not that worrisome of a species. So one of the management questions had to do with what's the status of non-native species in the region. First of all, we don't have any records of non-native animals in the region, so we're just focusing our discussion on non-native plants. Around 600 infestations, and they just encompass around 273 acres, which is a tiny, tiny fragment of the whole YKL region, like less than 100,000th of a percent of the region. And as I've said many times before, the species that are associated with these natural regions tend to be ones that are these ruderal, really disturbance-related kinds of species, like plantain, common plantain, and pineapple weed, things like that. They're found like along the Yukon River, especially where you have the interactions of things like trails, the Iditarod Trail, or other kinds of human disturbance associated with those floodplains. And the most invasive species really found in those population centers. So here's pea shrub in McGrath near the library, I think it was, and bird cherries that are found in the ball fields near McGrath. And these are recruiting, apparently outside of the ball field area. And these are species that are expanding rapidly in south central Alaska, and really have a potential of altering at least deciduous forests in south central Alaska. So there's a potential for the species to spread. It produces these fruits that birds happen to like, thrushes and rusty blackbirds and other species disperse these seeds around south central Alaska, and it's recruiting pretty dramatically in these mixed deciduous forests. Sweet clover found on floodplains in McGrath, and I think yellow sweet clover has recently been found in Galena, I believe it was, in bird vetch. And so when it came to trying to understand what areas are most vulnerable to infestations by non-native plants, we took a little bit different approach than has been taken by lots of other REAs and other work in Alaska. Rather than modeling just single species and trying to figure out, okay, like, maybe orange hawkweed is considered to be like a really bad thing, and just modeling the distribution of that one species, we thought taking a more kind of a synthetic approach and understanding, what regions suffer problems from weeds in interior Alaska, and what are the environmental and anthropogenic variables that are associated with those weedy locations, and then mapping that back into the YKL region. And so we use classification tree analysis and random forest to do this, looking at, 311 fifth-level hucks across interior Alaska that actually have some survey data. So we excluded all of those regions that nobody's ever looked for weeds, so to try to remove that potential bias there. So we only are looking at places that have had some weed survey effort, but because there is also this potential for people to avoid giving data to ACEPIC about absence records, we chose this sort of threshold of like, okay, we can sort of withstand maybe 10 species that are not considered highly invasive for a huck and still think of that as, not really infested, right? But those hucks that have something that's considered highly invasive by that invasiveness ranking program, or that have more than 10 species, and typically are also associated with large numbers of infestations, we're calling those infested hucks. And then we look at what variables are associated with those infested hucks, and we had 19 variables, included climate, population densities, road densities, things like that. And the variables that came out as being really most important in explaining the presence of these infested hucks were road densities, as well as population size. Those are by and large way more important than the climate variables, but thaw date and length of rivers was also useful in distinguishing these areas that were infested from those that weren't. And the CART model outputs that we got, had moderate model performance, I would say. The misclassification rates were something like 18%. And then when we mapped the predicted infestation vulnerabilities with known locations, it seems like there's a pretty good correspondence of those empirical data with areas that are projected to be vulnerable to infestations now. But one of the take-home messages here is like all this blue color here is indicative that there's low invasion vulnerabilities across much of this region. And that those vulnerabilities don't change that much by 2025 and slightly by 2060. And that's mostly associated with this potential increase in road density along the Kuskokwim River that may or may not happen. So that's kind of important, I guess, caveat thinking about how these scenarios play out, right? If no roads are built there, then we wouldn't project that invasion vulnerability would be that much higher. And the CAs that, the CEs, the conservation elements that we thought would be potentially most impacted by invasive species are going to be these large floodplains where we already have, a significant number, I guess I would say, of these, not particularly invasive plants, but, good, reasonable numbers of them found on floodplains and sandbars, and the species that are going to be probably most problematic or have the potential for being most problematic in the future would be sweet clover, right? So this is found in the grass and can easily spread down the Kuskokwim River, as it has done along the Nenana River, Sakine River, Mapnuska River, Knik River. So it's a pattern that we've seen play out elsewhere in Alaska that we don't want to see happen in the YKL. Deciduous forests, these seem like these could be potentially susceptible to invasion from bird cherry, pea shrub, and bird vetch. And, both, I think, the floodplain scenario with sweet clover that's been shown to inhibit willow regeneration, that has a potential of impacting moose forage and successional regimes along these floodplains. So that could pose risks for moose. Things like bird cherry, that produces these cyanogenic glycosides that have been implicated in poisoning of young moose, so that could be potential risk for moose.
Has it resulted in death, Matt?
What's that?
Has it resulted in death?
Yeah, there's been a couple of yearling moose that have died from that. I think moose learn pretty fast, but, and then, and when it comes to the aquatic CEs, it seems like the places that are gonna be most at risk are gonna be, you know, these lakes and streams where we've seen Elodia and reed canary grass expanding in, you know, south central and eastern parts of the state. So if those got established in the YKL, those would be really difficult to eradicate, and there's been lots of documented ecological impacts to resources like salmon for both of those, Elodia and reed canary grass, that we don't really want to see happen in the YKL. And in terms of animal species that it might be worthwhile to keep an eye out for, and this was just sort of off the top of my head, and maybe Tracy can add other species or discount some of these, but ones that seem to me as potentially dangerous are these defoliating non-native insect species, particularly these sawflies that are so prevalent in south central Alaska. They're causing lots and lots of mortality of thin-leaf alder around rivers. Those are some images from state and private forestry. And starlings are established in Fairbanks, and I don't know all the interior communities, but that seems like that bird species has a real potential of establishing in the YKL if it's not already there. And mostly this is an agricultural pest, but people have suggested that it competes with other cavity nesting birds. There's a flicker that's being attacked by a starling around a nest hole. And then the one last aquatic thing that I'll bring up are these quagga and zebra mussels. And this is a sort of, you know, story that, like, it seems like this is a problem for the Great Lakes or, you know, the East Coast or something like that. In 1986, quagga and zebra mussels were discovered in, like, Lake Erie, and it subsequently spread throughout the Mississippi Basin, and it formed these, I don't know if you can see the spouting of this propeller by all these mussels. They're really small mussels, and they're filter feeders that reach these high densities and change the trophic ecology of lakes and rivers and things. And it spread dramatically through the Mississippi Basin, and then I guess something like 5 years ago, these long-distance dispersal events showed up in Lake Mead, since spread throughout California, and recently it's been found in British Columbia. So we really don't want to see this in Alaska. There's been some survey effort for well-used lakes that have, you know, lots of boat traffic, trailer boat traffic, and they haven't found any evidence of these species.
Question.
What is it?
I understood all the threats from everything but the gypsy moth. Did you say was the problem?
Yeah, I didn't.
Is it a defoliator too?
It's a defoliator too, and there's been, I think, just a couple individuals that have been trapped in Fairbanks by state and private forestry. So it doesn't seem like that there's any established populations of gypsy moths, but they're pretty major defoliators east of the Rockies, I think, in particular. Okay, and then one of the last management questions had to do with vectors for how species move around. And this was answered through literature review. And some of the kind of important points, I think, to reiterate here or bring home is that for there to be real problems associated with invasive species, you really need these three events to take place. First of all, you have to have that transportation of the propagules, and then those populations need to establish, and then finally they need to become, you know, large populations and high biomass before you really see those ecological and economic events and or consequences. And so lots more management effort is being placed in this transportation of propagules and understanding the vectors of how non-native species move. And while there's a lot of stochasticity in how invasive species move around, they do generally follow patterns of people, right? So people and their goods. And this means that, you know, the regional hubs of the YKL are probably the ones where we're going to see these incipient populations of bad species established in places like Galena, right? And then another thing that I think is worthwhile to remember is that most introduced species are introduced on purpose. And so we have lots of ornamentals and things like that are planted in these communities that have the potential of expanding outside of the anthropogenic footprint and causing problems. And those seem like they're easy pathways to shut down. Contaminants might be a harder vector to shut down, but already the BLM and other groups have done a good job, I think, in trying to reduce this potential for weed species coming in through like hay and straw, like on the Iditarod. There can be up to 600, or on average, there's 600 weed seeds per kilogram in a bale of straw or hay. And that's in Alaska's work that's been done in Alaska by Jeff Kahn. Another potential pathway is just on the footwear of people, and a study looking at seeds moving to Svalbard found that on average around 4 seeds per person were being transported, and they split this study up into different kinds of people who were going to Svalbard, like tourists and scientists and things like that. And the group of people that had the most seeds per person, as you can imagine, were the scientists, right? They're the dirtiest folks. But also, I think when we think about the kind of folks that are moving around into and out of these regions, right, there's going to be lots of people moving from the lower 40, or not moving, but going to non-resident hunters and fishermen and things like that have dirty hip boots and things like that. So there's a potential, I think, for lots of non-native species to be brought in that way. And then float planes and barges or boats, this is a potential pathway. This is a photo here in the lower right of waterweed or Alodia. It's on the rudder of a float plane, so easy for those things to get moved around. And I think this is the last slide, or second to last slide, and I've already mentioned many of these things before, is that we don't have a whole lot of data on non-native species presence or absence in this region, particularly absences. Most of the survey has been concentrated where people live, and there's not been a whole lot of research done on vectors of how non-native species move. And particularly, we have lack data on ecological impacts. And again, this infestation vulnerability model has moderate performance, and it has a really coarse spatial scale, so it shows these big fifth-level polygons. It doesn't mean that whole polygon is really susceptible to invasion. It's probably going to be really localized near the anthropogenic footprint. And then there's all the variability associated with scenarios and the climate. And then the last one, we don't really understand the potential interaction of many of these disturbance regimes, whether it's permafrost loss or fire, and the probability of weed establishment. And I think I've gone over these applications already, but hopefully we've developed some kind of baseline information for where non-native species are found and where they might be likely to show up. And also, we hope that these products are useful in identifying where you might want to go out and survey for non-native species in the future. Yeah, which areas are high priority for weed management. Oh, and I forgot, I've got forest damage to talk about too from insect pests. So these are maps here showing forested areas that have been damaged, and the vast majority are along these riparian corridors along the Yukon and Kuskokwim rivers, and a little bit near Port Ellsworth and Iliamna area. So the image on the left is more of the historical deforestation damage, and the image on the right is more recent, last 5 or 6 years. And then this is just the damage that's associated with spruce beetle, and once again, the more historic record shows that the damage has been concentrated along the Yukon and Kuskokwim rivers, with some impacts in the southeastern part. And limitations associated with the insect outbreaks. This is a map showing where the aerial surveys have taken place, right? So those are really concentrated, along those major riparian corridors and near the larger hub communities. So there's big portions that haven't been surveyed, and of course this is aerial detection, right? And so there's very little ground truthing that's been associated with this. So actually associating the insect species with the kind of damage is somewhat limited. And once again, I think that these outbreaks of these are largely native defoliators. Like, these are ecologically really important, play a huge role. Lots and lots of mortality in south central Alaska as well as the YKL and other regions. But they're really species specific, and there's something like 15 or 20 defoliators that are associated with this region, and they're really stochastic in terms of when they happen and where they happen. But there is some indications that climate warming is going to accelerate the amount of damage by defoliators, by Edberg and others. So that's all I want to say about that. Be happy to take questions at this time. I think I was kind of going over.
I have a question just about overall education or preventative efforts, So, I mean, what we're seeing is that there's not a lot of invasive species, and so the tendency, I think, is to not give it a lot of attention or funding in terms of preventative or education, and the problem is once the species takes hold, the eradication it's a really hard thing to control, so just in terms of...
And everybody gets disappointed because they put all this money into it and it doesn't fix the problem. Right.
Yeah, so just like Alodia, for example, because that's a recent invasive, and so what's the effort on a statewide level, and then in particular for the YKL, is there any push to...
Yeah, I know that the BLM has had a strong interest in this. Lori Thorpe and Eric Geisler and stuff have been strong promoters of creating, helping groups create cooperative weed management areas to remain vigilant and be able to collect data and supply that to the statewide weed database and things like that. So I think there is a pretty strong interest, and Alaska is probably better than most other states in terms of its enthusiasm about non-native species control. We have a lot to lose, I think.
In the effort, in Australia, they make you wash your boots, especially if you go from one major region to the next. Right there in the airport, before you get off that premise, you wash your boots, or before you go to the port, you wash your boots. Any effort like that in some of these more protected areas?
The only thing that I know of that does something like that is Metlakatla Indian Reservation, that they wash...
they can make their own decisions.
Yeah, they wash cars that come off the ferry.
Yeah.
But that's it.
Huh.
Yeah. All right, well, thanks.
Thank you.
Matt, this is Lori Thorpe. I have a question.
Go ahead.
Yeah, what do you think is the most proactive approach that the public land managers could take versus, reactive once there's infestations in place? What would you recommend?
Well, I think that education is a really big one. I think that probably the people who are living in the communities are going to be the ones that are most, aware of seeing changes, and they know, where to bring that information to. That might be a good option.
It seems like that, folks are becoming quite aware of the threat to the resources, but there's a huge lack of infrastructure on how to deal with it and how to actually prevent it. We don't have wash stations. We don't have, areas for the mitigation can actually occur, and that I think is a huge limiting factor. Yeah. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on that. Any advice to managers?
Right. Yeah, and I would agree with you. I think that as a state, we're really pretty good at early detection, but we're not that good at rapid response. And I think that when it comes to, being able to get people with backpack sprayers on a plane to, whatever, take care of a problem, you run into all the land ownership issues and resistance to pesticide use and things like that make it problematic. And I'm not sure, I don't think I have a simple answer for you.
Okay, well, I appreciate that. Thanks.
Matt, this is Tim in Fairbanks. I didn't have a question, but just a comment. You may or may not remember when we had our kickoff meeting for this YKL RIA, one of my rants was about how poor the invasive weeds section was in the SNK RIA, and I got to say I'm impressed. This is 5,000% better than what we had in the SNK.
Yeah,
Thank you.